and we're here to talk about coaching and supervision. I'm going to hand over to you, Alex. Perhaps introduce yourself first, and then Andrew, and then we'll kick off with our conversation, which I'm very excited about.
Me too. Thank you. So my name is Alex van Oostveen. I'm a coach and a coach supervisor. I live in a small town called McGregor in South Africa. And so my history is straight after school, I went into the South African Air Force to be a pilot and got my wings in 1997, and then had about a 20-year career giving flying instruction, flying helicopters, being an instructor at an operational squadron. And I think that's really where my passion for teaching people, helping people develop, and my own communication skills has come from. I got introduced to a model of psychology called transactional analysis in about 2001. And that really led me to doing my first coach training in 2007, 2008. I left the Air Force at the end of 2014. Andrew and I did our supervision training together. And now I am a sole proprietor of my own practice.
Wonderful. Thanks, Alex. And Andrew, welcome.
Yeah, thank you. I'm really excited to have this time with you. So I came into coaching. I used to be a swimming instructor when I was finishing my degree, which was in accounting and management accounting, and knew very quickly that that profession was not for me. So as soon as I had the degree under my arm, I ran for the hills and had a couple of really exciting interactions with my swimming clients, working around goal setting and being part of their journey. And at that point, I thought I would love to have this kind of relationship outside of the swimming pool as well. And as you know, the universe conspires for you, I happened to meet people in the coaching industry, and then met my initial coach trainer, Karen Pratt in Cape Town, and knew without a doubt that I wanted to do her training. And lo and behold, Alex was my mentor on that training on day one. I'd met Alex once beforehand. And we haven't looked back since. So that my initial coach training was in 2012. As Alex said, we did supervision training together. Was that 2014 or 15?
2015.
15. And now have my own practice. I'm based in Pretoria, working with people around the globe, thanks to technology.
It's amazing, isn't it?
It is.
I would love to start off with a conversation about what supervision is, because I've felt some real resistance to the whole idea of supervision, particularly in the States. And yet in Ireland, certainly, if you want to go for any large contract as a coach, you have to demonstrate that you're actively involved in supervision. And for the people that I supervise, I think we all agree it's a wonderful space, not only for sort of developmental and for reflection, but for support. And I think people are particularly feeling that at the moment with the situation around the world. So I guess to start off, I'd love to hear well, I know when we were talking before this morning, we've been talking about the supervision triangle, and that might be a useful start point to understand that, so that people can get a sense of what supervision is, because I think there's some confusion there.
Do you want to take that one, Andrew?
Andrew, you were talking about the supervision triangle and what supervision is. So I know that
I had a little tech issue.
Because I remember being liking I always think of the triangle as the kind of the managerial element, the supportive element, and the developmental element. And you had a different way of phrasing it, and I know that lots of people do have. And Andrew, I think it was you that had a nice way of putting it that sat well with me.
Sure. Sorry, I did miss some of that stuff, but if I got you, you want me to say what the language was that I used at that time?
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. So when we look at that supervision triangle, there's many different schools that have added really sound psychological backgrounds to the elements, and the language that I love makes it come alive for me, which is around the working with the coach as a person, working with the coach as a practitioner, and or a professional rather, and then a coach as a coach. So it's the person, the professional, and the coach.
Okay, so I guess that would map out with the person being what I know is the sort of supportive role of supervision, which is, as people have been describing to me recently, it's very rare to be able to have this conversation with other people that really know what you're going through, because it tends to be a one-to-one space, and because of our ethics, we can't discuss the content of those conversations. So it's a really nice supportive space. And then the professional space, I'm presuming, is what I would call the managerial element.
Yes, I've got this open just so I've got all the other language stacked around the triangle.
That's the kind of, when you hear the potential red flags about ethics, or when you're really checking in on contracting, or that kind of piece.
Yeah.
And then the final piece, the person, the coach would be the developmental area, how I label it. So that's the kind of encouraging of the deepening of competency, the perhaps suggestions about other elements. Perhaps you could expand on that a bit, Alex, as well.
Yeah, it's interesting because listening to the words that we're using now, I realize that people who aren't familiar with supervision may interpret those words differently to how we understand them, because we're so familiar with the whole process. So I think on a social level, when we hear a word like support, if you don't mind me jumping back to that part of the triangle, we think it's about maybe encouragement or having someone to lean on during a hard time. And I think that may be what happens there to some degree. But
and a shared experience, I think.
Shared experience. So there's something cathartic about just being able to voice what an experience was, particularly if that experience has come with some negative feelings. Maybe, in some types of work, particularly counseling or therapy, there might be secondary trauma and that kind of dynamic going on. But in the supportive element of the supervision triangle, it's really about the person as a practitioner. What of their own psyche gets entangled with their practice or with the clients and with the client's issue? So we're talking about the actual manifestation of countertransference and transference. So it's about really getting in contact with those experiences as the supervisee in the supervision process. So it's recognizing the feelings that I'm having, whatever those emotions are, whatever those physical feelings in the body are, and the behaviors that come with that. What is that of your own stuff, and how did it get triggered by the client? And that cathartic process is, it's not just about voicing those, but it's about resolving those, and not necessarily in a therapeutic way. Let me clarify that. So it's not therapy, but it can be therapeutic.
Yeah.
And then going to the developmental side, it's once the practitioner is feeling grounded enough through that cathartic process, they're able to make sense of what was going on. And I think different supervision modalities do this in different ways. In the way that we've been trained, it's about using a piece of theory to understand what the dynamic was. So this is typically something like Karpman's drama triangle, or maybe ego states.
The drama triangle is people may know it as the kind of victim, persecutor, rescuer triangle, just to kind of.
I think something that's also been, I found really useful to distinguish at this point is that it's that piece of theory is there to get some distance from the story. So it's like being in the theater and getting onto one of the balconies as opposed to staying on the stage. And what's valuable at this point is to name that it's what model comes up for the client, for the supervisor, a supervisee at that point. And the supervisor doesn't have to know the ins and outs of that piece of theory. It's what makes sense for the supervisee at that point.
Just to clarify, because I'm getting slightly lost.
Sure.
When you're talking about are you saying that, for example, you might say, do you know what, listening to this, it's reminding me of a model, like the drama triangle, are you aware of it? As opposed to saying, gosh, you sound like a victim. Is it kind of, is that the distance that you're talking about?
It could be. Even, you know, how you joked about the second one, you know, Alex has been my supervisor on and off for many years now, and I trust him enough to be able to say that kind of thing to me.
Yeah, to name it. Yeah.
Because we've got enough trust around that. But what comes up more often is to actually ask the supervisee what comes up for them to make sense of this.
Yeah.
And that's because that's where the real transformational stuff comes from, rather than somebody else coming in and trying to diagnose your issue for you.
I think it's also worthwhile to say that not every coach has that theoretical foundation.
Yeah.
And this is something I've, yeah. Do you want to go ahead, Mary, or shall I?
No, it was just reminding me of when we first met and you said to me, what's your philosophy of supervision? And it totally threw me because my brain doesn't think in that way. But, you know, when you're applying for a piece of work, you're always asked to set out what's your philosophy of coaching. And it's kind of, I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. So the philosophy is something I think that keeps evolving, and it evolves as you deepen your awareness of yourself. You gain experience, you learn what works, what doesn't work, and some things work for some people and not others.
Yeah.
So this is one of the barriers that I've encountered in supervision is clients come to supervision session, and when I started supervising, I had assumed that they would have a good enough theoretical understanding of the relationships between people and that exist in systems to be able to make sense of them. And it actually relatively recently, I changed my mind to not assume that.
Yeah.
So, and this is I think a worthwhile point mentioning about supervision is it takes time to get to the point in supervision where the client can name that model or piece of theory that describes what's going on well enough. And so up to that point, I think it is okay for the supervisor to do a little bit of teaching. So to ask the client, I agree with Andrew, to ask the client first, so is there a concept or a piece of theory that will describe what's going on? And if they don't have that, if something comes up for you as the supervisor, then it is obviously useful to name that and to have a small educative bit of the session, maybe 5 minutes, and then ask the client how to make sense of that. And the more you go through that process, the more you're encouraging the client to actually take those theories and models back into their practice and apply it. So this is one of the benefits of long-term supervision. And it obviously doesn't have to be with one supervisor, but the more you do it, you actually broaden your understanding of people's work and of oneself.
Thank you. And I think there are sometimes other ways of doing it as well. So things like metaphor, for example.
Yeah.
You know, those give us great tools for people that don't have that background. I'm learning that background, but it's like my background is pure science. I don't have that, that historic training that I've learned through coaching and through my training as a supervisor. But metaphor I can grasp, I can run with, and it gives us a tool to discuss things. I think we ought to move on into well, you had the question about what is philosophy, but I actually think it might be easier for people to get to grips with supervision if they had an understanding of what it feels like to be supervised. What really goes on. For me, the overall thing at the moment is that safe space, the supportive element, but it's a safe space where it's almost where someone's got your best interest and they want the very best for you, a bit like a coaching space, but there's in that you have that with your client, but you're with essentially either with other coaches or with a supervisor that knows the work of coaching and can challenge you and push you and knows the role and allows you to open up, and something in that, and I'm not articulating it terribly well. So I'm going to hand over to you, Andrew, perhaps, and see what you think it feels like to be supervised.
What comes to mind immediately is how I experience myself at the beginning to the end of a supervision session. So when I come in as a supervisee with my own question around either my coaching or my coach supervision, there's something that feels like it's stuck, or maybe there's a sharp corner that's poking me in my side from my blind spot, and I can't quite wrap my mind around it or get a firm grasp on it. And taking that into the supervision session and working with my supervisor to figure out, what is this about? What's the question here? And as I get through this process of articulating the question, I start to feel like my fingers are wrapping around the shape a little bit, so that's poking me. Maybe I can move away a bit so it's not so painful anymore. And then when start working on what is it that I want to get out of this, the shape starts to get some color, and then by the end of the session, I know what this thing is, I know where it's coming from, and I know what I want to do about it, and I feel comfortable again. I feel like there's nothing left that's uncomfortable at that point from my blind spot. I feel lighter and more enabled, and just to add on enabled, more potent and empowered as a practitioner at that point.
Thank you. Alex, do you have anything to add? What's your experience?
Yeah, I was just listening to Andrew now. I was reminded of an article in the Transactional Analysis Journal by Vita Cassoni on parallel process, where she measured using MRI the brain patterns in clients and supervisees and supervisors, and noticed that there was a resonance between the two. So what happened through the process of supervision was the supervisee came and they had a measurable pattern in their brain scan that the supervisor took on and transformed, which then transformed the supervisee. So, I mean, there's something actually happening there on a physical level. It's not just about ideas, but we're changing brains. And so this is a good description for me of what it feels like, because you might come feeling stuck or feeling like, for me, when I get anxious about something that's happened in practice, my head feels solid and full and like there's pressure inside it. And through the process of supervision, so doing that grounding work, being supported and going through catharsis, making sense of it, and strategizing on how to respond, my head feels clearer. I feel more integrated into my body, into my emotions. I feel more potent, more fluid and adaptable, back to full potency. So it's a very noticeable shift. It's transformational. It's not just about what interventions did you use, how did that work out. So it's less. I mean, there is a transactional element to it, but the true power of supervision is in the combination of the transactional. So what happened and what do we do about it, but also the transformational. Like, what do you need to shift inside you? Your approach to the clients, your approach to yourself, your approach to your practice.
Yes, and hearing you talk, it's just reminded me, this, it's almost like a supervisor helps you find the pattern and the meaning in things, so it helps you align. And actually that things that don't quite sit well somehow, or that you're wondering about after a coaching session, the coach, so you can come away thinking, I'm not quite sure about that, or did we really go where we should have gone here, or there's sort of discomfort afterwards. And I think working with a supervisor can really help you align that, and actually ongoing, all the evidence about neuroplasticity shows that if we can kind of change the way I think, we're going to fire more in that direction once we learn how to do that. It's part of a process where with the supervisor's help, we start to do it ourselves as well. And ongoing, I think this is why the ICF have introduced the need for reflective practice in the new competency framework, which neatly brings me on to that. The kind of yes, the need for reflective practice. I guess it might be useful just to give a definition. What does that mean, reflective practice? I mean, for me, it means taking a chance to look back over my work, to look over it, to think, okay, what patterns do I see emerging? Yes, what you said earlier about what models does this fit? What do I spot? What don't I spot? So I do a little bit about that myself. I do it with peers, with other coaches, and I also do it with a supervisor. What else do we need to think about when we're thinking about reflective practice? Is there anything to add? I mean, there's
the word practice.
Yeah.
So it's practice and theory combined. Having an experience, making sense of that, freeing oneself from the unhelpful patterns that come from that experience. That's often the client stuff or the organization that the client is working in, themes that come up from there. And there's a useful phrase that you can't properly solve a problem or solve a problem in a sustainable way unless you understand that problem. So that process of making sense of it using some kind of metaphor or a new narrative or a piece of theory is helpful to do that. And then you can design an appropriate action. And obviously check on things like multi-party contracts and ethics standards.
Yeah. That's bringing me into another area, and I'm conscious of our time, so we need to start to think about wrapping our conversation up just as I broaden it out. This other thing about when we're coaching, we can tend to be a bit focused just on our client. And I think the other thing that's reflected in the new ICF competencies and a role of supervisors is to help us look systemically. That supervisors look at the system within which we are coaching. So it's much, it's to the client organization, their systems, their families, the world, in effect. I mean, my background, I said I'm science, I'm an ecologist, so I've got the kind of Gaian thing going on in my head. But that's another thing that I like about supervision, that it's much broader, because we can get very focused in. Yeah. We were going to talk about practices of group supervision and individual supervision, and I'm very conscious that we're coming towards the end of our time. So I'm just wondering, in a nutshell, what kind of stuff could we expect? I know one of you does group work primarily, one of you does individual. I do a bit of both. I don't need to talk at this point. So I would love perhaps to offer a kind of what things might you do within one of your supervision sessions.
if I have a
Go,
have a go.
Andrew. Yes.
Yeah, so I'll maybe speak more from how I use supervision. So I am in an ongoing supervision group, and what I get from that is an opportunity to have a regular check-in with a supervisor about what's happening in my practice. I also get to hear what other trusted colleagues are dealing with in their own practice. So it's a wonderful, rich place to be in, and the way how the supervision looks changes in each call on the needs that we're each bringing. But what I then will do is, if there's something that I feel is a particularly sticky point, I will tag that and work with a supervisor one-on-one for an extended, focused period. And I have a couple of different supervisors that I have in my mind who I know that I work well with them in this way, and others in different contexts. So I have, for myself as a using supervision, that's how I curate my my resources.
Thank you. And Alex, any final comments about your practical process?
So I think there are costs and benefits to each one. For group supervision, it's often more cost effective because just in terms of the business plan for the supervisor, they're having more income from a larger number of people, obviously. That's a benefit for the supervisees. I think a cost is potentially the depth of the work. And I say potentially because an opportunity is to learn from the group process. So what are the dynamics happening in the group? What are relationships like in the group? How do people learn from that? And that's something that you're not going to necessarily get to the same extent in one-on-one supervision. I prefer one-on-one because I think the subconscious is more open to greater depth of exploration in a one-on-one environment than it is necessarily in a group environment, depending on the developmental level of the supervisee. Group can often be more transactionally focused, especially with supervisees who are not familiar with the process. They can want to get advice from other group members as opposed to do reflective practice. But reflecting on my own journey, I think that's really just part of it all. It's learning about how it works in groups, learning that there's different stuff to be gained from the one-on-one, and then partaking in both.
Yeah, I think that's it for me. I used to just offer one-to-one. Now I offer group. I think it's a very different dynamic. And I think probably we'd all agree that people should engage with supervision and try it on for size and find what works for them and what works for them in different situations as well. It's useful to have, to experience all formats and just know that there'll be certain pieces of work that you might want to work one-to-one with, and other pieces where you will learn from the group as well as the supervisor and learn about being part of that group as well. So there are advantages to both.
I think if you keep in mind that it's a learning partnership in one-on-one or group, that's really the thing that frees up the moving forward. The stuff can be hard in groups. You don't want to name things. You don't want to be the one to stand out. You don't want to name that you're upset by something that someone's done. But if you all see that as learning opportunity, then you really get something out of it.
Absolutely. Thank you both so much for your time this morning. It's gone really fast.
It's been wonderful. We need a part two.
I will tag you underneath the video so that you can answer any questions and tell people about your programs that you offer.
Thank you so much. It's been a great opportunity.
Wonderful.
You may want to join me again in Zoom briefly after this.